Hi again, it's Jason from Fraser Valley Rose Farm, and this time of year I always see a wonderful influx of new people coming into the rose hobby, and they could be brand new to gardening itself and just have seen pictures on Instagram and Facebook of wonderful roses that they want to try for the first time, or maybe they're gardeners, successful vegetable gardeners who are coming over to roses, coming around to trying those for the first time. Either way, the problem is they come with a fair bit of baggage, and I have to say, who's to blame? Us guys, the experts. When they've gone around and looked for information on roses, they found themselves detailed spreadsheets and schedules and routines of feeding and spraying and deadheading and, detailed instructions on angles of cuts and everything else. And frankly, none of that is really necessary for learning the hobby. Actually, if you're already a good gardener elsewhere, roses will be no different for you. If you're successful at gardening, you're a successful rose gardener right out of the gate. And if you're brand new into gardening, that's okay too. It's really not that hard. I think most of the reputation of roses is fairly undeserved, and we make it too complicated. Now, I don't want to be too hard on us experts. We want to give detailed information because people ask detailed questions, and some of those people are very serious about their roses. They want to exhibit their roses, they're very excited, and they want to know exactly what supplement and what should be thrown into the soil and all the ways to optimize their rose experience. But that's not what you're after as a first-time rose gardener, and frankly it can be confusing and disheartening to see all of that detail. I will say one other thing is that some of the expert information that's out there is just wrong or outdated, and so I want to go through this video here real quickly just as an overview of 5 topic areas that you will hear a lot said about roses, but you can probably ignore a good portion of it and just rely straight back on basic gardening techniques that will make you successful with roses. Number 1 on my list, let's talk about fertilizing or feeding your roses. And with some of the information out there, it's so specific you might think you'd have to pull out the fancy napkins and put out the napkin rings for them. Roses are not that fussy about what they will feed on. The fertilizer that you use in veggie gardening is perfect. So if you had manure or compost, if you put alfalfa pellets down, which I find is a good bulk organic amendment, all of those will feed your roses beautifully, satisfactorily, and also improve the soil as you go along. A little bit of mulch at the base of the rose will help to maintain moisture, and if it's an organic mulch like shredded composted bark or that kind of thing, it will actually improve the soil over time. A basic balanced feeding of NPK, fairly balanced, and in this case I'll use the example of 6-8-6 or 10-10-10 or 20-20-20. All of those are perfectly fine for roses. You will see people who go far more specific than that, and things that I can debunk straight away. Epsom salts, they say you should be heavily fertilizing with Epsom salts on your roses. No, probably not. Unless you know that your soil is deficient of magnesium, then you probably don't want to be out there following that piece of outdated advice. Of course, there will be people who are deficient of magnesium, and then Epsom salts will help them. But if you don't know, you don't know, and you shouldn't add it. Other things that people do, they start putting together these buckets of alfalfa that they throw an air stone into, and they bubble it and they mix it with kelp meal and all sorts of ingredients, and you'll see these very big complicated recipes of fermenting this alfalfa, and you end up with this sloppy mess. Oh my goodness, I couldn't think of a worse way to encourage people to come into the rose hobby than think that they have to do this magic potion making. Certainly, if you want to experiment or play with that later on, that's fine. But basically, here's your schedule for feeding your roses. One time, first thing in the year, I would give them a fairly substantial top dress of manure or compost, or a similarly balanced chemical fertilizer if you swing that way. And then throughout the season, if you see that the roses are doing well, but you want to give them a little extra oomph, then you can add on with a little bit of extra top dressing or liquid feeding just to bring them on along a little bit more. Because roses are heavy bloomers, you can feed them a little bit more, but this obviously is a direct analogy to veggie gardening as well, is that when you see that your veggies are growing aggressively and doing really well, then you don't need to add a lot of fertilizer. But if you think that they could use a little boost, then you add some more fertilizer. Some of that comes with experience. I would say it is far more dangerous to over-fertilize than it is to under-fertilize. So if you're a beginner, I would just start out with the basic one good top dress a year per the package instructions, or with something organic like manure or compost, and be satisfied with that. Number 2 on my list is about spraying, and it really was the thinking in the latter half of the 20th century that you really couldn't grow a successful rose garden without having an ironclad rotation of chemicals that you would spray on a schedule just to keep the bugs off. And the modern thinking on that has evolved quite a bit. I know a lot of good rose producers now who have gone to organic or more natural techniques and really allow more tolerance for a little bit of a blemish on the leaves or a little bit of problems with insects on your plants, because they know that those things will balance themselves over the course of a season with the predators and such. But if you go in there with the chemical sprays, you'll knock down both the pests and the predators and you can never get a handle on it. That's the thinking that is more prevalent these days. It's more of an integrated pest management approach. I won't say that there isn't any time when you would have to go to a harsher chemical spray or that, and that remains an option to you, but I don't think that most gardeners really want to start the hobby with this idea that they have to go out and buy 5 or 6 chemicals that they're going to rotate on a 2-week schedule and have to gear up into protective equipment to take care of their plants. Rest assured, that is not the case with roses either. Number 3 thing I want to talk about is pruning, because people are so intimidated by pruning, and the truth is that roses are no different than your other garden shrubs in the basic goals and techniques of pruning. People talk a lot about when you should prune your roses. I've done a couple of videos on that as well, and yeah, there can be more complicated answers, but basically roses can be pruned anytime. They don't have to be done in this very specific window early in the spring when the forsythia is blooming. They have a wide range from late winter all the way to, say, almost midsummer that you could do a good amount of pruning on your roses. If you don't hit them before the first flowering, hit them after the first flowering. Not such a big deal. The goals of pruning is just to open them up and give them a good shape. You don't have to prune every rose every year. If they're brand new and they're small, don't bother. Wait until they put on a little bit of weight. And then once they have, then just prune to empty out the center of the shrub and give it a little more space so that each of the stems has a little more room to grow. Those are the basics. Now, you can get a lot more specific on this. And I know a lot of people talk about you should do angles on your pruning cuts. You should seal your pruning cuts. You have to do it at a certain level for a certain plant to maximize your blooms. I don't believe in any of that, or most of it anyway. If you want a little more information about what I think you can and can't do when pruning roses, I have a video I did a few years ago called 7 Rules for Pruning Roses, where I do go through the expert rules of pruning roses and for the most part discard them. So I'll link that up above in the video so I don't have to go through it here today. But basically, if you already know how to prune a hydrangea or a spirea or a tree or a shrub of any sort, just to open it out and make it more air circulation to the center of the shrub. That's what you do for everything. That's what you would do for roses. Number 4 here, I want to talk about rose selection because frankly there's a little bit of snobbery that goes on when you go into the rose related Facebook groups and groups around. And you know, I've seen people on there distraught because people talk down their selections and said, oh, I don't like David Austin's, they don't perform well in our climate. And you know, I'm like, oh, why are you hassling this person over their choice in roses? And I can even be guilty myself of having a little bit of snobbery towards the knockout roses. But you know, frankly, it's not my choice what goes into your garden. You should choose for yourself what excites you, what you find meets your needs. If you're looking for something that flowers cleanly and reblooms constantly, a knockout rose or a landscape rose might be just the perfect thing for you. And if you love the look of David Austin roses and the full romantic look and the scent of those roses, I wouldn't let anybody turn you off by smack talk on the news groups. One other thing I'll say on this topic is that oftentimes you'll hear a little bit of this snobbery against the bagged roses you'll find in the grocery store or in the hardware store. Some people call them body bag roses, as if they're not going to succeed in your garden. And the truth is, no, they're grown by the same people who grow the other roses, the bare root roses that you find in the garden centers. For the most part, they may be a different grade, but in general, I've done very well with them when I've bought them. So don't let other people get you hung up on an ARS rating, a number rating that comes with the plant, or what's the hottest rose this year. Go with your gut, go with what you're excited by, and then of course you can check out internet sources just to see if those are disease resistant and trouble free in your area. That's one thing I probably would research very quickly on the roses. But other than that, just go with your gut and get some experience under your belt. You'll find out within a couple of years which roses perform really well for you and give you what you want, and which ones are probably shovel prune. Get them out of your way and move on to the next one. Topic number 5, and I promise it's the last one, is where to locate your roses or to site your roses. And there's this old conception hanging out there that you should have a dedicated rose garden where only your roses go, and that's the only thing you plant there. I have my rose garden behind me here, my rose garden, and it's actually filled with all sorts of ground covers, perennials, annuals, other shrubs, trees. I try to put as much biodiversity in there as possible. What you'll find is that if you stick a whole bunch of roses together, or any crop for that matter, that the specialized pests will get in there and they'll have a really easy time spreading from plant to plant to plant. Whereas if you have mixed plantings, then the beneficial insects, the pollinators that are attracted to roses, also will help your veggie plants and your other plants in the garden. But likewise, all the beneficials that will eat the aphids, the spider mites, will balance out the pests on the roses, and you'll have a better garden for it. So definitely I would say mixed plantings over dedicated beds, and many of the dedicated rose gardens or the public rose gardens are starting to move in this direction as well. So they're coming around to that. The other thing I'll talk about is in terms of the location is the conditions. People talk about having perfect light exposure. You don't need perfect. 6 hours a day is usually what we recommend, but if you had a little bit of shade in the afternoon or you had some high dappled shade, that might even be an advantage in some warmer climates. About soil, well, the only thing I will say about soil is if you have a very rocky, very hard soil, or a very alkaline soil, or a very poorly drained soil, now you may have to do some remediation on that soil to do well with roses, but I think you probably have to do it for any other garden plant as well. If you have an average basic garden soil, your roses will do just fine in it. You don't have to bring in a special soil just for roses. It's the same thing, that myth about rose fertilizer that I talked about before. You don't need a specific mix of fertilizer or a specific mix of soil or anything for your roses. Basic good garden conditions will make your roses succeed. All right, that's all I had for you today. I hope that you found that useful, especially if you're a brand new rose gardener. And if you have any questions, please drop those into the comments below and I'll see what I can do to help.